everyone. I'm really honored to welcome Ms. Mari Kuraishi to the podcast today. So I first heard about Mari-san through my work with the U.S.-Japan Council. She's a council leader there. And at that time, she was the head of GlobalGiving, which is a crowdsourcing organization. Now she's decided to move on from GlobalGiving, and she's now the president of the Jessie Ball duPont Fund in Florida. So thank you very much, Mari-san, for joining me today.
I'm so pleased to be here, Shady.
Thank you. So without further ado, I wanted to ask you about your upbringing and where you were born and raised.
Sure. So I was born in Japan, and I grew up in Japan and Italy, and then came back to Japan, and then went to West Germany. And from Germany, I graduated high school and came here to the United States for college.
Okay. What led to that upbringing? Were your parents working abroad, or?
Yeah, my dad was working for Shiseido, a Japanese cosmetics company that was at the time basically in the 70s and 80s, going global. And so he was in a lot of different international markets.
Okay, that's amazing. And how was it growing up? Did you go to international schools, or were you the only one in your local community, or would you mind explaining a little bit about that?
So I moved to Italy when I was 6, which is basically first grade. And there was no Japanese school in Italy where we were. So I did join an international school, but we also had Saturday schools, if you are familiar with the tradition of having supplemental Saturday schools. And I also remember doing these, not virtual, it was mail education through the department, through the Ministry of Education, where they would send you little exercise sheets. And then at the end of the month, you had to take a test, and then you would mail them back. And then they would correct them and mail them back to you. So I resented the whole thing. Weekends were spent doing Japanese, studying. So I looked forward to the week.
And when you were in Italy, were you speaking Italian and German when you were in Germany, or?
I spoke Italian quite fluently when I lived in Italy. I picked up some German, but not that much.
Okay, that is amazing.
I can get by if I'm a tourist.
Okay. What about when you were moving back to Japan? Was there a cultural shock, or how did you cope with that?
So I moved back to Japan effectively just once when I came back from Italy, and I was in junior high by that point. And the cultural shock was less around Japan itself. I shifted from a British international school to an American international school. And probably the shock was compounded by the fact that I had ended up skipping one grade when I was in Italy. And the British system has 13 grades, and the American system has 12. So then when I went back to Japan and went from 6th grade to 6th grade, I'd effectively skipped 2.
Wow.
And so I was 2 years younger than everybody. I was 10 or 11, others were 12 and 13. And there's a big difference between a 12 and 13-year-old and a 10 and 11-year-old. And the combination of shifting from a British school to an American school, being made fun of for my British accent, and then being a kid amongst a bunch of prepubescent or pubescent teenagers was one of those situations that in retrospect, was less a cultural shock that had to do with moving from Italy to Japan and more to do with my school context. But yes, I did experience quite a bit of quite a number of challenges
Oh my
shifting here.
goodness. And how did you cope with that? Like, I'm sure it was difficult to go to school every day, but did you find friends that you could get along with, or?
I did. I found friends I could get along with, and it was, I didn't, end up being a loner or anything like that. But again, one of my friends was an American girl who grew up. They didn't live on the base, but her parents were military.
Mm.
And so we would go over to her house. Her house was filled with American foods. And both her parents were working.
Mm.
She had two brothers. And life in that household was so radically different than the life I had at home, in terms of more catch as catch can, more general rambunctiousness because there were two boys in the house.
Mhm.
And, I think there were points where I was just like dumbfounded by how different you could be while you were going to the same school and taking the same classes.
Mhm, mhm. That's really great that you found such a great friend. Um, and I also wanted to shift a little bit and to about your career.
Hmm.
So, how did you end up in the field of international development in the World Bank? Was that did that have something to do with your upbringing?
It did not. In college and in graduate school, I studied Russian and Sovietology. I had entered into a PhD program in political science, focused on the Soviet Union. And I had taken all my classes, taken my comprehensive exams in the fields, in the subfields of political science. And in the middle of it, the Soviet Union fell apart. And that meant that my unit of analysis now was like 12 different republics.
Mhm.
I was in political science, which have failed to predict the single most important thing that happened to my unit of analysis, the Soviet Union. And I was like, this is not looking good.
Mm.
I am not going to spend the rest of my life dedicated to political science, studying the Soviet Union. So I cast around for jobs,
Mhm.
and I heard through the grapevine that the World Bank was hiring Soviet specialists. And I was like, great, I am a Soviet specialist. I can get
Mhm.
in.
Mhm.
So I did, and but it was I had no idea what the World Bank did. If in the interview, if someone had asked me, do you know what we do? I would have said, absolutely not. Not studied international development. I had been studying ICBMs and throw weights. So I have no idea. But they hired me. And I was solely focused on the idea that I could use Russian, my knowledge of the Soviet system, and get to travel there, which I had gotten to travel there once. I had gone in my undergraduate days, but in order to get to the Soviet Union, I, like everybody else in the program, had to lie and say we were going to become teachers of Russian. So we wrote
Interesting.
essays saying we were going to become teachers of Russian to extend the fraternal understanding between the Russian and American peoples.
Wow.
Half my classmates were going to work for the NSA or the CIA or the
Mhm.
Defense Intelligence Agency.
Mhm.
So no, we weren't going to extend, sort of fraternal understanding, but that was the only way to get to go. And now I could finally travel there legitimately, and that was incredibly exciting.
That is amazing. May I ask how you first became interested in Russian and the Soviet Union?
I became interested in Russia because, as I said, I had moved to West Germany for high school. And West Germany in the 1980s was dominated by, protests against the placement of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Pershing, and there was a lot of angst about the Cold War, and was typified by trips to like Berlin, divided Berlin, and where you could like look over the other side and see East Berlin, and you could travel to East Berlin, but you could see what a huge contrast there was between West Berlin and East Berlin. And so I was really motivated to figure out why. How
So
could you have such different systems in the same city, let alone the same country?
would you mind explaining about your work on the World Bank and what led you to ultimately found Global Giving?
Sure. So I spent a good 7 years working on Russia as country officer. It was a very exciting time. I was 25, one of the youngest people on the Russia team, but our Russian counterparts were all about my age because they were young people who had been plucked out of graduate school. And they became my friends. I could speak to them directly. Everyone else at the World Bank had to go through an interpreter. We would spend long evenings, inevitably drinking vodka and trying to figure out how to make sure that the communists wouldn't come back again. And so that experience, I know, is not typical for someone who works at the World Bank. The World Bank typically has a much more hierarchical relationship with its clients, whereas my experience of Russia was we're in it together. And, as I sort of left the Russia program and went on to do corporate strategy for the World Bank, in the meantime, the bank had sent me to executive MBA program. So I had learned a little bit about corporate strategy, among other things. It also became clear that while there was a role for international treaty organizations like the World Bank that would extend sovereign financing to its members, and that financing was important and the programs we put in place were important, those programs did not reach the grassroots. It did not fundamentally engender more creativity or more commerce, simply, in the countries that we worked in. So as my co-founder Dennis Whittle and I were working on corporate strategy, which also included business innovation, we came to the conclusion that certainly in the field of innovation, it was much more important to support grassroots innovation than it was to sort of lay bets on top-down innovation. And this was 2000, right? The beginning of the dot-com boom and the transformation of the world with the real... the internet was initially used primarily for email. But over time, the whole world opened up. And we said, what might happen if we use that technology to make the efforts of grassroots organizations in the developing world visible to and possible to be supported by the donors that live in America to begin with, but other parts of the developed world. So that's how we came up with the idea of global giving, primarily as in an attempt to solve the problems that the World Bank was facing.
That is incredible, because you really seem to be really, really ahead of your time. And so how did you find the tech specialists, the people who would really create the platform and make this happen, execute your ideas?
Yeah, so we didn't know what we didn't know, right? Which is helpful. I have a thesis that most startups would not start if the founder had any idea of how difficult it would be. You have an unrealistic expectation of how easy it will be, and you go on from there. It was the early 2000s. People were barely, eBay was one of the top brands on the internet. Amazon was only beginning, and they were doing books and CDs.
Wow.
And not that many people were using Amazon then. People were still uncomfortable with the idea of typing in their credit card numbers online. So we were early, arguably too early, to support donations online. And which was good because it took us forever to build our first prototype. It took us at least a year. These days you could gin it up in 90 days. We worked with vendors in India because they were cheaper. We shouldn't have, because they were not used to building systems that faced customers. They were used to building back office functions. Very talented developers, but have been working in a very different space. And honestly, there weren't that many people who knew how to create commercial, customer-facing things. So we had what was okay at the time. And, we launched it. All sorts of nonprofits came to us because they were like, oh, great, we can reach donors. Not, donors came by, I don't know, once every 3 months or something.
Oh, wow.
Truly tumbleweeds, just cobwebs growing. And it was only in 2000, at that point we said, okay, obviously people are not getting up in the morning, opening up their browsers and saying, how can I help?
Right.
That's just not in their mindset. So let's go find people where they are being encouraged to give. And at that time, the biggest programs were corporate employee giving programs, dominated at that time by the United Way.
I see.
But we said, surely some companies are not satisfied with the United Way because they're global companies. And it's fine to be able to support your local humane society, but what if you wanted to support your the Indian village back home that you were from? So we went and tried to sell ourselves to large Fortune 100 companies that had global work forces. And they turns out they didn't necessarily think it was a great idea to work with startups that have barely gotten their act together. These are large companies that think through how they work things. So that even though that was ongoing, was harder going than we expected. But we were still sort of going, in part because both Dennis and I, and also another practical co-founder of ours, Donna, would occasionally take salary holidays so that we could keep paying other people. And then at the end of 2004, there was a Southeast Asian tsunami.
Yes.
And suddenly people were Googling, searching how to help fishermen in the Philippines or in Indonesia. And we were the only result that was popping up. And suddenly, literally, people were waking up and searching for what we were doing. So it's timing matters, and we were fortunate that we could last into 2004 without folding.
That's really amazing. And did you have to do some fundraising as well and have to convince others to
Yes.
believe in the system?
Yes, we fundraised ultimately about 10 or 11 million dollars to get started, because we were not break even until 2011. So it took us 10 years to get to break even. And in previous business plans, we had said, oh, we'll be break even in 3 to 5 years. Not true. But the 10 to 11 million dollars given to us from people like Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, Skoll Foundation, the first CEO of eBay, Hewlett Packard, and the Saul family. These donors basically got us started.
That's amazing. Did you have a network with them already, or how did you cultivate that relationship?
We just went and asked them if they thought this was a great idea. I think the way we connected with Pierre was that Pierre was giving a talk at George Washington University. Dennis went to listen to the talk, and after the talk went up to him and said, we're building the eBay of international development.
Wow, so it's really grassroots on your part as well. Oh my
Oh, yeah.
goodness. That is really cool. And then fast forward, and you made this organization into a really huge, well-known one, where you're really supporting people who are affected by disasters all over the place, including the Great East Japan earthquake. I remember that. And I was so surprised that you decided to move on, and because I think that's something that not a lot of founders are able to do, especially at the height of their success. So if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit about that decision, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, so at the time I left, I'd been associated with GlobalGiving for 17 years. Dennis had started Feedback Labs and other things 10 years in to sort of get himself off the sort of founder active engagement at GlobalGiving. I'd stayed on another 7 years, but I knew that it was important to shift gears and go back to ensure that the organization could stand on its own without a founder around. There are fewer companies, but many nonprofits where the founder is around, many decades after they have started, and we didn't think that was good for the organization. It gets too closely identified with that individual. So I announced I would leave, about 16 years in, and 17 years in, I left.
Okay. That is incredible, especially because I read some of your media articles, interviews that you did at that time, and it sounded like it's not that you had something lined up. You decided to leave at a certain point and then look for a different career or a different pathway afterwards. That takes a lot of courage.
Yes, although I think I was also pretty confident I could get a job. Maybe it wouldn't be the perfect job, but I think sometimes it was the same when we left the World Bank. People would ask us, well, why are you leaving the World Bank? You have nothing lined up that will actually pay a salary, which is true. But, from my point of view, that's true, but I was pretty sure the World Bank would take me back if I went back. And if the World Bank wouldn't, somebody else would. And I had enough money set aside that I didn't have to immediately make an income. I'd lived pretty simply and frugally for a bit, but there's, it's not impossible to sort of downshift your consumption and say some things are more important.
That is really inspiring. And would you mind explaining a little bit about your current work at the Jessie Ball duPont Foundation?
So I run a private foundation. The Jessie Ball duPont Fund has about $380 million in its endowment. So it's a medium-sized foundation, and it is based in Jacksonville, Florida. It was founded by Jessie Ball duPont, the wife of Alfred I. duPont. There is a separate Alfred I. duPont testamentary trust that is much larger, his fortune being considerable. But she had means of her own, and that's what started the Jessie Ball duPont Fund. We operate primarily in the states of Florida, Virginia, and Delaware, which are associated with Jessie. And it's Florida's young state philanthropically, so there aren't very many foundations in Florida, at least in northeast Florida. So we are what I characterize as a big fish in a little pond.
Okay. That is amazing. And how did you end up being in Jacksonville? Did you find your job first and then decided to move there, or?
The fund recruited me to come to Jacksonville. I was not looking for a job in Jacksonville. I was not looking for a domestic foundation.
But you enjoy living there?
I do.
Okay. And where would you consider your hometown when you look back to everything, where you grew up and where you worked? And
I don't have a hometown. The longest I have lived anywhere is Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I lived there for 30 years. But would I consider it home? Not exactly. I love going back to Japan. I go back at least once, if not twice a year. But there is no home there that I grew up in. And I love going back to Italy. I love going back to Germany. But again, neither of those places are home exactly.
So sometimes I feel a little bit lonely about that. When I'm feeling positive about myself, I feel like I belong to many places. But sometimes when I'm struggling with the relationships, for example, I feel like I don't fit in anywhere. So how are you able to, not feel lonely when you belong to so many places at the same time?
Yeah, no, I think you put it right. We belong to a lot of places, but not in the same way that someone who has grown up and stayed in a place belongs. And on the upside, I will go to a foreign country and delight in discovering, its local foods and the neighborhoods, and just getting to know a place, right? And that thrill of discovery. And I recognize that I love discovering that because it's what I have gotten good at doing. To sort of discover the quirks of a place and to begin to make it your own by discovering the quirks of a place. And I will occasionally find myself on vacation somewhere thinking, oh, I could live here. And I don't think most people go that far to think you could live there. But I know I do that. And when I was growing up, it tore me up to leave. It tore me up to leave Italy. It tore me up to leave Japan. It tore me up to leave Germany. And because I was thinking about all the friends I would leave behind, all the habits that I had created in that place. And I would look at some of my friends who I knew were grounded in that place. They might go to college, but their parents were going to be there and they would be coming back to that place.
Right.
And I didn't have that. So I think it's that it's really only when I compare myself to somebody who has a different life experience that I suddenly feel, oh my gosh, my world is so different than theirs. If I don't compare myself, and if I think about my own life, would I change any of it? No, I would not give up having lived in all those different places. I would not give up having made all those different friends. So it's always an exercise of stop comparing yourself to someone else whose experience might be different. You can put yourself in their shoes if you want in order to understand them, but don't try and analyze, what they've got better than you. It's just not terribly productive given, our experiences. It just sort of takes you down a dark path.
Right. Okay, thank you so much for that. I really needed to hear that. And you mentioned some friendships and how you've always had to say goodbye. If you don't mind, would you mind telling me if you have a family and how you decided to, how you were able to find someone who might be able to move with you, or you might have a long distance relationship?
Yeah, so my family still lives in Japan. My parents are divorced. So my mom lives in Yokohama, my dad lives in Kobe. And it was an acrimonious divorce, so they don't talk to each other and they don't like to hear about each other. And so that's led to additional sort of compartmentalization in terms of my own life. And I got married 20 years ago to Dennis, who was the co-founder of GlobalGiving. And it's, I count myself lucky to have someone who is not just personally compatible, but professionally compatible. I don't have to explain the professional side ever, right? He understands what the stresses are. He understands the issues. And so in that sense, I have a situation where I'm in very familiar ground.
One of the things I really admire about you is that you have this really quiet leadership that we don't see a lot. I think, especially someone who's like a founder of an organization, because you have to convince others to invest in it and believe in it. I think the stereotypical leader that you see is someone who's very out there, outspoken, etc. So how did you find your own different style of leadership? And did it take a while to come into your own terms, or?
It did, and I was even more quiet, earlier times. I think if I mentioned to someone that I'm an introvert, they kind of look at me and say, "Are you really?" Because I've trained myself to be externally focused and engaged and not have any problem talking to strangers, right? But I did have a lot of trouble talking to strangers. And I remember in one of my first jobs at the World Bank, I had a great boss who, and again, I was one of the youngest staff members. I was also frequently the only woman in meetings, and would frequently end up being, "Oh, will you go and get us sandwiches for lunch?"
Wow.
Type situation. Nothing unusual, really, for a junior female staff person. He said, "Mari, you don't speak up at meetings." And I said, "Yeah, but usually by the time the meeting is 3/4 in, what I would have said has been said." so I don't need to speak up. And he said, yes, you do, because if you don't speak up, then we don't know what you think. And so we don't know where to place you in the constellation of opinions and thoughts. And we need all of that in order to make the right decision. And I had to admit that that was true. Like, I think he had other objectives in mind, as in, if you don't speak up, you will not get noticed and you will not advance in your career. But he put it to me in more sort of terms that were understandable to me. And I started to make a point of speaking up. But because I was sort of had to be pushed into speaking up instead of sort of naturally speaking up, I've taken to sort of, usually I don't say a lot, but I do think about what I want to say. And, you know, in later, many decades later, people have told me, oh, you know, you don't speak very much, but when you do speak, we listen.
Oh, that's great.
In part because I don't speak very often, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, well, that's effective.
Yeah.
That's a feature, not a bug.
Okay. If I may ask if you have any advice for people who might be struggling with their identity. You mentioned that we shouldn't compare ourselves to others, but is there anything else?
I would say that it's a privilege to be able to speak another language fluently, which is to say that you understand how people who speak that other language think and organize their worlds. You have a particular insight into another culture, another country that others don't. And you can code switch from one to another. And that's both a privilege and a power. There are many people in this world who only grow up in one context, who will only experience one context, and should they end up in another context, will find it foreign, terrifying perhaps, incomprehensible. And you don't have to be in that position. You can thoroughly understand. You don't have to love everything about, you know, there's a reason I don't work in Japan. After college, I didn't go back. It wasn't the greatest place for a woman to succeed professionally, right? But I can understand that, act on it, but still appreciate the incredible consistency and discipline that Japanese culture brings to any art or profession, right? Mm-hmm. I can appreciate that about Japan and hope that I still carry some of those tendencies and still, you know, prefer to live here. So I think when you feel like you're neither one nor the other, you should remind yourself that it's a powerful privilege to have insight into more than one culture.
Thank you so much. And what about people who feel shy? Like how, if they want to someday found an organization or lead an organization, would you have any advice for people like that?
I would say that you don't have to suddenly become a social butterfly. It'll be tiring for you to do that anyway. But I would suggest that you sort of dig deep and think about what you have to offer And you have to build up the confidence that what you have to offer in terms of substance or in terms of connecting with somebody who may be equally introverted as you, to be the one to extend the hand of welcome, to be the one to start the conversation is a gift you're giving them, right? If you put it in that way, I think, at least for me, it was, I'll go and find someone who doesn't look like they are engaged in conversation and are having a hard time connecting. I will go up to them, say, how are you doing? How is this? What do you think about this conference, right? And they're delighted because they didn't know how to get the ball rolling. If you think of the conversations and the connections you make as gifts, perhaps it's a little less daunting than I have to advertise myself, because fundamentally I don't think that works anyway. Advertising yourself is it's a very thin and superficial effect. Whereas if you connect with somebody and they feel like you reached out to them and they're grateful to you, you will have a conversation with them that is far deeper than you giving them your elevator pitch.
Thank you so much. I absolutely needed to hear that. And I think it's wonderful how you described it as a gift, because every moment is special and you never know who you meet who might really help you. I think I covered all the questions that I would like to ask, but is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed?
No, but I wanted to applaud you for starting this podcast and beginning to open up this audience. There weren't so many of us in the past, but I think there will be more of us. And this is the experience of every immigrant in this country, right?
Yes.
There are far more of us than people think, and we do a good job of trying to pass as we're just Americans like you. But I think unpacking some of the complexity that we bring to the table is really, really important.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm so grateful to you because I know we haven't had a chance to talk in depth like this, but the fact that you trusted me to do this and are willing to make this public is such an amazing opportunity. So thank you so very much for that.